Welcome to Seekers and Finders, the podcast where we explore the infinite pathways to truth, creativity, and connection.
We are using words for things that they were not made for. Words were originally, like, the reason we have words is to go, oh, there's a table over there. I'm going to set something on it, and you can communicate that to someone else. When we try to apply that to internal experiences, things get messy really, really, really quick. Or ethereal experiences, whatever label you want to put on them. When it's not like in the physical plane, it becomes a lot harder to be precise with words. What can people answer? Like, basically any human can answer directly about their experience. So you say, well, what kind of emotions are you experiencing? Do you experience any emotions? Things like that. So it doesn't matter what tradition you're from, doesn't matter even if you're atheist, whatever, you can say, oh yeah, I am experiencing a range of emotions. Like, I'm happy at some points, I'm angry. Sometimes I don't experience any emotions at all. Or you can go, oh wow, yeah, when's the last time I felt something? So there's a range of emotional experiences that people can recognize and talk about, even if it's difficult to reflect on, even if some of these things escape you. There's still things that you can look at and say, oh, here is the answer for this. For me, that was the core of my own exploration of this. And then it became the core of helping other people through this process as well. Because the Deepening Framework, which I have on my website, it is 100% based on my own exploration. I had my shift, I cobbled together my own protocol. I shifted into what Jeffrey Martin calls location one, layer one, like the very beginning of this process, basically, where you're still mostly in normal life, like your mind, your sense of self is all basically still intact, but you can just go looking and find that sense of, do I feel fundamentally okay right now? And anytime, no matter how stressed you are, no matter how bad things are, you can find a yes.
Hi, and welcome to the Seekers and Finders show. Today's guest, with your host, of course, Gary Falk and Stephen Bright. Today's guest, Rastal. I think it's going to be very interesting and exciting because now my background with we'll find out about Rastal's background, but my background with Rastal is I met Rastal through the same venue. I meet a lot of people. That's the Finders Course community, which is called Perfectly Okay, pok.org. And so my interest in Rastal is twofold, okay? Number one, I want to find out more about his one-on-one work because he has, from my point of view, he can correct me, has adapted some of the stuff that we learned or we encountered or we experienced in the Finders Course, namely fundamental well-being. We can go into that later. And has taken it maybe to another level or another step. We'll find out about that. And my second area of interest with Rastal is the upcoming October, 3rd to the 5th, the Amplify conference. I didn't go last year. I'm going this year. I want to find out what that's all about. So that's the intro. Rastal, do you want to give us a little bit about your background and how I met you through the Finders Course community, but I know you had, your background goes way back. So over to you.
Yeah. So right now, most of what I'm doing in the space is I'm doing consciousness research. I've developed, a coaching protocol called the Deepening Framework that's open and available for other people. Other people are building programs off of it actually already, which is awesome. But I did do a lot of one-on-one coaching to develop that and refine it. And then a lot of my energy right now is going into organizing and running the Amplify. We're calling it the Amplify Gathering now, because it's not really a conference. It's like kind of a hybrid conference retreat, but the community is the most important part of it. Absolutely. Like, it's about making connections with other people who are on this journey and experiencing what Jeffrey Martin has publicly called fundamental well-being. Probably the most popular term for it is like awakening or persistent spiritual awakening, something like that. But yeah, people who are already experiencing this has been sort of my focus in my work. The way I got involved with the Finders community and perfectlyok.org was a very roundabout way, I've been aware of Jeffrey Martin's work and research for since like 2011. I've been following it off and on. Back then, his framework, the progression wasn't a progression yet. So he researched how the experience of, persistent non-symbolic experience is what he was calling it, but this like lasting deep inner peace that was unshakable, that he calls fundamental being now. How does that show up in different ways across individuals? Doesn't matter what religion, what framework, what background they're coming from. How does that show up? And he was really trying to get to the root of it. Like, what are the core common things? If we get rid of all the interpretive layers of it, what's going on as the actual experience? And he spent, over a decade, well over a decade, researching that and as deep as he could. But originally, he didn't see there being a progression of someone like starting out at an entry point and then sort of progressively going deeper. Originally, he was calling them buckets instead of what he now calls locations, because he did not want to believe that there was an actual progression going like deeper as you go. He just, at the time, the understanding was that awakening just sort of happens. That's at least the kind of the popular, I guess, academic understanding of it. Though, like, plenty of traditional like spiritual traditions and religious traditions have maps and models, right? Like, that's just been a thing for millennia at this point. But academically, it's kind of there's been resistance to that idea of there being like some like clear, almost linear progression happening. Anyway, so back before he discovered that there was actual progression, he was calling them buckets. That's when I first discovered his work. He only had one or two interviews publicly available. There was not much research that he had posted, but there was something that really grabbed me about his research. This idea that this experience of awakening, enlightenment, satori, non-dual experience, whatever you want to call it, it almost wasn't spiritual anymore, is how he studied it. Like, it wasn't like you could experience it through spiritual things. That's how most people seem to experience it. But it was just kind of a normal experience. Like, this is a thing that anyone could experience. That, I think, was the thing that gripped me from the very beginning. And I was very curious. And so, I didn't immediately try to pursue it or anything. And he didn't have courses available yet, or, the 45 Days to Awakening challenge that he has since created and made available. He was just like giving information here and there. And every few years, I would go back and just like, okay, I wonder what new things he's discovered about this experience. Like, this is really, really interesting that people can just have a shift, like a clear shift into lasting inner peace. And that it kind of turns down all the negative self-talk and like all these different things that cause suffering. So like, let's see what he's discovered. So every few years, I would dive back in and kind of go exploring the new stuff he had published. And every time I would read his research, actually, I would get glimpses of the experience of fundamental being. Usually they would only last like a half hour to a few hours. A few times it was a few days that it lasted, where I was just like, suddenly I knew that everything was okay, right? Like, deep down, I didn't have to go looking for it. I didn't have to think, I didn't have to convince myself, but I just knew. I was like, oh, everything's fine. Like, everything is genuinely, fundamentally okay. Which was such a different experience than my normal anxiety driven. Like, I experienced suicidal ideations most of my life. I dealt with depression a lot. And then to suddenly feel like everything was okay, and I didn't have to work to feel like everything was okay. It was just there. That was such a shift that I never thought was possible. But then, inevitably that glimpse would fade away. And as it was going, there was always a sadness. I was like, oh man, like, it'd be really nice if this just persisted forever, because that seems like that would just change everything about my life if this could somehow persist. Um, but there was a part of me that, as it was fading, I always just knew, okay, it's just not time for me right now. But I know it's there. Like, obviously, I keep experiencing it. I keep getting glimpses, so it's there, and it's waiting for me whenever I'm ready, basically. So that kept happening, off and on over a decade. So 2021, I hit severe burnout with my day job. I'm a software engineer. In my day job, I hit severe burnout. I went on a 6-week disability leave. It was really, really rough. Yeah, like, definitely my mental health was heading in a way where I was starting to head down towards a suicidal direction, which I had thankfully been stable for a bit. I'd been going to therapy and things like that. But I could see that like stuff with my day job was like too much pressure, whatever. There was a lot of things that was going on. It was also still during the pandemic, so everyone was having bad mental health. It wasn't, so like there was just a lot of things on top of things, on top of the stress from my day job. So 6 weeks of disability leave, I got back into therapy, doing EMDR to address my PTSD that was still sort of lingering. And then I got into a more stable place, and I was focusing on positive psychology, things like that. I was really feeling like, okay, I'm in a more stable place now. I had been able to go back to my day job and not have the pressures and stress. And then I sort of had this memory of like, oh, I wonder if maybe now might be an interesting time to go see what Jeffrey Martin's been doing, because I knew that he had offered courses by this point. I was on the initial email whenever he said, "Hey, we're actually going to be doing this course called the Finder's Course if you want to actually experience this," and it just didn't feel the right time at the time. But so I was like, maybe now I'm just like everything feels sort of like it might be right in my life to try to get that feeling of everything being okay to persist. Because I'm imagining if somehow I could get that to persist, that would probably have amazing knock-on effects for everything else in my life. Like, because the glimpses I had gotten, it felt like there was no possible way for it to not radically change my life down the road. So I started, reading up on everything he had published publicly, all the talks he had done, interviews. He had done guided meditations at, I want to say MIT. He did a guided meditation, like kind of one-off course, things like that. I was cobbling together all the free resources he had. And I decided to kind of make my own like shifting protocol, like based on all the information he had out there. So I didn't do the 45 days to awakening, which is what most people who are in part of POK have either done that or the Finder's course. I didn't do the Finder's course. I was just like, let me see if I can do this on my own using the information that he has out there. So based on everything I knew, I was like, okay, I'll give this 6 months of an hour or more a day, like bare minimum an hour a day, every single day. I'll spend up to 6 months, because if it's even remotely as like life-changing as I suspect it is, and as like, I mean, Jeffrey Martin's a really good salesman and he made it sound amazing, right? So I was like, if it's even like a fraction of how good he makes it sound, like even accounting for any hype that he might be doing, which he may not, but even accounting for any hype, it seems like it'd be worth spending at least 6 months trying to get this experience. So I was like, okay, 6 months. I have my protocol. I know what I'm doing. And it took 3 days instead. And suddenly I was like persistently experiencing this. So it was my waking experience, that fundamental okayness was just there, that I could access it. It wasn't always in the foreground. It wasn't always obvious. But if I went looking for it, suddenly it was always there. And that change was everything. Because suddenly if I was stressed at work, I could go, wait, but like, am I okay? Oh, I am okay. Why am I stressed? So it really, like, even though it's in the background, that subtle shift changed everything. So I was planning on staying just like in like early on in the progression from his research. Wasn't planning on, like, that was all I had ever wanted, was just to get stably into that experience. I thought I was good. But then I started experimenting with, how do I go deeper in this? How do I bring it more to the foreground? And within a month, I had progressed past the locations that he had publicly documented, which I didn't plan on going far at all. And it just sort of happened. I just kind of like figured out a technique that let me just push further arbitrarily. And yeah, then eventually, because I had connected to his work, I was connected to his work. Even though I hadn't gone through his courses, I eventually did. He had offered, I think it's still on offering, what he calls Thriving in Fundamental Wellbeing. So it's kind of like a follow-up course after you've shifted persistently into fundamental wellbeing. Then, like, how do you integrate it with your life? How do you make sure it's stable, and like really learning to bring it more to the foreground, that sort of thing. So because I did that course, and then I was able to connect with the Finders community, which was his official Telegram community, which then led me to POK, perfectlyok.org. And eventually, because I had pushed so far, I had connected with Luciano, who's now my research partner. He was talking publicly about pushing far, and no one else was talking about this, location 10 plus in Jeffrey terminology. So me and him connected. We started going deeper. We started kind of talking to other people we could see who were on the same journey as us and sort of going in the same direction as us, going as deep as we could in fundamental well-being, while living normal lives. Like, I'm still a software engineer. Luciano was a researcher and he was a professor and things like that. Other people that we've engaged with are software engineers or teachers or things. So we're all living normal lives. We're not becoming monks, right? But somehow we're going deeper and we're having these really profound, deep shifts in consciousness. And eventually, someone convinced me to do a joint talk. That was Eric Unger. He convinced me and Luciano to do a joint talk with him on misconceptions about late locations. So it seemed like there were a lot of ideas about what it means to go further and really go deep in fundamental being, to push the limits. It meant you were going to have to give up your normal life and things like that. And the evidence from our lives was that might be true for a part of the progression, but really all of it comes back, and you're really able to stay integrated, and it all comes back to be fully integrated with your normal life. And so, yeah, from that talk, it kind of has gone on from there. People seem interested in the fact that, I didn't. But real quick, and then people seem interested in the fact that I didn't go through Jeffrey's course, that I kind of did my own techniques. So that's kind of what led to me doing more talks. I talk more about how I did all that, basically, which led to the protocol and all that stuff.
So I watched your YouTube interview with Gareth and Luciano before we came on. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I'm bringing this up is because we have a lot of subscribers who are disciples or ex-disciples of one or another Indian spiritual master.
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing that I noticed is that their casual talk about samadhi and immersion in Brahman. Now, Gary and I left our spiritual path in the late 70s, and we were with the Guru for several years. And we, or at least I'll speak for myself, and it's gotten to the point where meditation has become part of my daily existence. So the meditation has moved into immersion into that state, even though I know you all understand this. But the concept of when Gareth was talking about moving into Savakapa, Nirvikapa, and Sahaja Samadhi, I've seen people in that state. It takes a lot of work, and you can't just move into it by some fact of understanding a concept. And the immersion in Brahman really wasn't totally explained, that Luciano was trying to talk about being immersed in Brahman, because he talked about it being like being in deep sleep at one point. And I can tell you, my experience is not in deep sleep. It is of the most awakened state of being. There is no sleep involved here. There is absolute attention that is fuller than anything you could possibly experience. I just would like to hear from you, because I didn't get that much from that YouTube video, because you didn't really speak that much. So
let me just comment on that real quick. One, I don't have any familiarity with those terms that you're throwing around, which is why I didn't talk during that interview. Like, Luciano and Gareth were trying to link up on terminology, right? But there's kind of a few things you touched on that I think would be good for any person on this path to understand. One, so the work I'm doing, I actually don't consider it spiritual. Like, it's just like, I think it's just as normal as exercise and nutrition. And for a long time, food was like purely a religious concern. Like, that's where we got all of our food advice, was from religion. Like, I'm in South Louisiana. I'm born and raised here. I lived most of my life here, even though I've lived elsewhere. But right now we're in Lent, and every Friday during Lent, no one eats meat. So like, people are still getting food advice from religion here in the 21st century. However, we now have this other perspective known as nutrition. So if you have specific goals, like I want to lose weight and things like that, you can still do the religious food expression, but also you can supplement it with this scientific perspective. that's more how I see my work is like going to these really specific sub goals. They are not all of spirituality. They are not like, I don't even focus on integration that much, which is a huge part of this journey. Like, how do you, okay, if you have even glimpsed something, how do you then go live from this place? Like, that's like other people that I work with are focusing on that, but that's just, I'm focused on how do you get the underlying baseline to shift? That way the rest of your nervous system can kind of catch up. And for me, it's not even really a spiritual thing. And that part of it can go very fast. However, there is still so much work to be done of unraveling all the habits that we have from our entire lives that are not from this place of peace. Um, Making sure that our behavior is actually in line with this more deep truth that we now have, which actually takes a lot of work. It doesn't come for free usually. There is a lot of trauma that can come up, even for people who didn't think they had any trauma. So all of this, like, there are quick aspects of it, but I mean, this is one of the reasons I never use the word enlightenment with anything to do with my work, because like, to me, enlightenment or like, in my mind, all the words you're using right now is like, yes, those are different than the work I'm focusing on. I'm focusing on a very tiny portion of it. But yeah, to actually say that you're living from these places is a bit of a different thing for it to be like everything all the time for you. I don't,
I'm glad you
yeah.
explained this. No, this is really important
Mhm.
because anybody watching that video, and I'm sure will people after they watch this may go back and watch that, and it was very interesting. But
Mhm.
the whole concept of the terminology that was used has
Yeah.
to do with spirituality. It had
Right.
nothing to do with getting yourself together as a human being under the terminology of spirituality, where you
Yeah.
separate it to get yourself together.
Yeah.
And that's cool, man. I think that is fantastic.
So this is a thing that Jeffrey Martin discovered was like, for different Buddhist lineages, and this applies to every religious or spiritual tradition, is that he would find teachers within the same branch who are using the same terminology, but they mean completely different things by it. This is one of the reasons that Jeffrey Martin kind of he started looking at, okay, what's the underlying phenomena? Like, how do your thoughts change? How does like the level of mental activity change? How do your emotions change? How does your relationship with time change? So like focusing on these things that aren't, they're like a layer below the interpretive layer. So like you kind of get away from the spiritual labels, which unfortunately just have a lot of baggage with them these days. And what Luciano was trying to do in that conversation was literally just meet Gareth in the way Gareth uses those terms. So it's not about any like
Okay.
broad thing
Okay. Yeah.
necessarily. So
Yeah.
like, and we're coming from like, Gareth, we probably talked about that. Gareth was he was one of our research subjects. He was part of our research and everything. And Luciano and I are trying to be very like precise in our language of these later, more advanced things. But again, we're talking about something really specific and precise. But if other people are using language that borrows from traditions to talk about, like, and they're applying it to these things that we're not necessarily using that language for, then yeah, it gets confusing. That's part of why I just like didn't engage with that, because I'm like, I'm just gonna muddy the waters, I think, if I try to jump in, like, personally.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's what happened. And
yeah.
one other thing, and then we'll move on. Um,
Sure.
the thing that I didn't find in Gareth's talk, his experience, was the idea of surrender and humility, which is one of
Mm,
the keys to that whole height of being spiritual. Because once the ego is discovered and then basically understood, witnessed, and allowed to move out of that me concept, there's a state of surrender that is, part of the unconditional love thing that we actually talked about in our last podcast. I brought this up to others. My experience is very visceral when it comes to this spiritual thing.
mhm.
I was just going to mention that while I was watching that, I went on and I reminded myself about Franklin Merrill Wolf's book, Pathways Through to Space, and his visceral experience with the current that actually vibrates inside of you when you, not only when the Kundalini starts to rise through the chakras, but when the fulfillment and joy of the spiritual experience actually hits your body and you have that visceral experience. I don't know if that's part of your structure, but I do feel, an auric glow coming from you. So, hey,
Sure, I'll take it.
it's all cool. Besides the soft focus that you've got going on behind you.
Right, right. I just want to mention real quick you mentioned ego and surrender. That I have a really interesting relationship with that actually, because for me, it wasn't until very, very, very recently that I was able to even surrender at all to the process. Like really the entire time. And I didn't have agency and I still was not surrendering. Like there's an interesting thing that I could observe happening. But for me, like, I mean, I had tons of trauma growing up, like very complex PTSD, childhood trauma, like a lot of really nasty stuff in my life. And one unfortunate consequence of trauma is that it's very difficult to trust. So if in the past you have surrendered to the universe and then it led to a traumatic experience, that's difficult to open back up to. That was my experience 100%. Like on multiple occasions, I like opened myself up, surrendered and trusted. And like, maybe the universe is teaching me stuff, whatever. I'm not saying that I'm not trying to dismiss like that being a valuable lesson for me or whatever, or in some way, but like the nervous system, my body, my physical system here is like, well, fuck, we're not doing that again. So for me, actually, a lot of this journey, even though I wasn't the one making decisions, I could see that it was all just unfolding. There was intent behind every single shift further. Like I could see it happening. And it's like my body had to decide, okay, now is when we are going next. It didn't just happen. I didn't just let go and the process took over me, which is different than a lot of people I talk to. But it's not that different from a lot of people with deep trauma that I've talked to. So like, I just want to point that out, that like ego can actually drop away without surrender being in place, which I think is kind of fascinating. But I will say now that I'm able in a place where I can surrender, I love surrender. It's awesome. It feels great to just let everything flow through you. But it's actually not, in my experience, it's not a necessary part of the process, even though it's awesome.
But from a spiritual point of view, I think it's one of the last steps that happens, because when I'm talking about surrender, it's not the kind of surrender that the word kind of pictures, where you're giving up anything. It's a kind of immersion into a state where you are, that, there's nothing about you that is that important, because everything is part of that importance.
Rastal used two words that really popped out at me. And the two words were specific and precise. So when it comes to talking about these things, which can get very nebulous, all right, when you're talking about samadhi or Brahman or reincarnation or karma, these things mean different things to different people. So I think in order, from my point of view, in order to have a meaningful discussion about anything, we have to, one, be specific, like what are we talking about, and be very precise about it, and then we can have a conversation. Personally, I don't like to go out of the realm of my own experience, because then it's all speculation, and I don't do that. And I don't like to talk about things in general, and I don't know what other people's experiences are, and I can't know what they are unless, only through the way they communicate. So again, in anything that I would want to talk about, again, would have to be in the realm of what specifically are we talking about, and let's be precise with our language. Some person, people, even the word and this has come up in other of our podcasts. Even the word meditation. What the hell does that mean?
Right.
One
Right.
person, to one person means, oh, meditate. You go up to your shrine room and you sit in front of your shrine with your pictures of your guru on your zafu, and another person is meditation. I meditate. Another person would say meditation. Well, that's every day, every moment to moment, awareness of what's going on now. So again, so when it comes to talking about these things, I personally, I started to watch the video that Stefan alludes to, and I turned it off before I think you only came on like maybe twice, but I turned it off because I have left that whole world, the Eastern world, so to speak,
Mm.
because we were disciples of an Indian master, and we all every day we'd hear about karma, reincarnation, samadhi, nirvikalpa, sahaja, sevikalpa, and that's the beauty of I think Jeffrey's work was he brought all that stuff into the Western world. And I like what you say is like your word. It's not spiritual. We don't have to be spiritual. We don't have to wear beads and wear certain colors and have it's just everyday life, bringing that in. So this is what I like. So it's all about this underlying sense of fundamental well-being that no matter what's going on in your life, right? You can always, as you said, and you alluded to, and I know from my own experience, you can always stop and it's there.
Right.
You may not always be mindful of it, or you may be, depending on your own experience. But again, you don't have to be always mindful of it, but you know that it's like it's always in the background and always accessible. At any moment, you could just say, stop, what's here? Fundamental well-being. And I do think, again, and I want to go into your deepening process because I do think
Yeah.
the shift can take place very suddenly. It can, but that's
It'll be
just
gradual.
that's like just the opening, and now that's like a glimpse, like oh wow, and then you kind of get that it's always available. Let's talk about, unless you want to do something else, I want to talk about the process you developed, your deepening process. In
Yeah,
other
sure.
words, so let's say someone has a shift, however they do that, working with you or taking a course. Now, how to make that glimpse more of an ongoing moment-to-moment experience as to like, oh, I had a glimpse 2 weeks ago and that was good. How do I get back? So
Right.
let me just read a little bit as an introduction to your from your website, the deepening process, the deepening framework, which you created.
Mhm.
It's an actual title of a process, is a set of techniques for progressing in the experience of fundamental well-being. And I noticed, and I'm glad you don't use the words enlightenment, which can mean a whole lot of stuff. Awakening can mean a whole lot of stuff. We're talking about fundamental well-being, which I think everybody, certainly in the West, can relate to. Fundamental okayness. Fundamental well-being from the point where you have to go looking for a sense of fundamental okayness to the point where you can't even go looking for it because you just feel obviously okay all the time. So let's talk about that deepening process a little bit.
Yeah. First, before we dive too deep into that, I want to circle back to something you mentioned about like being precise and specific, because it's going to relate to the deepening framework that I talk about. We are using words for things that they were not made for. Words were originally like the reason we have words is to go, oh, there's a table over there. I'm going to set something on it, and you can communicate that to someone else. When we try to apply that to internal experiences, things get messy really, really, really quick. Or like even like, ethereal experiences, whatever label you want to put on them, when it's not like in the physical plane, it becomes a lot harder to be precise with words. So I'm going to set that as the baseline for what I'm about to talk about. Because in the deepening framework, the thing I really took from Jeffrey's stuff is that he focused so much on what can people answer, like basically any human can answer directly about their experience. So you say, well, what kind of emotions are you experiencing? Do you experience any emotions? Things like that. So it doesn't matter what tradition you're from, doesn't matter even if you're atheist, whatever, you can say, oh yeah, I am experiencing a range of emotions. Like I'm happy at some points, I'm angry. Sometimes I don't experience any emotions at all. Or you can go, oh wow, yeah, when's the last time I felt something? Like so there's a range of emotional experiences that people can recognize and talk about, even if it's difficult to reflect on, even if some of these things escape you, there's still things that you can look at and say, oh, here is the answer for this. So I'm saying all that because that, for me, that was the core of my own exploration of this. And then it became the core of helping other people through this process as well. So coming back to my own experience, because the deepening framework, which I have on my website, It is 100% based on my own exploration. So I mentioned I had my shift, I cobbled together my own protocol. I shifted into what Jeffrey Martin calls location one, layer one, like the very beginning of this process, basically, where you're still mostly in normal life, like your mind, your sense of self is all basically still intact, but you can just go looking and find that sense of, do I feel fundamentally okay right now? And anytime, no matter how stressed you are, no matter how bad things are, you can find a yes. So that's kind of the main difference that he differentiates between fundamental well-being and non-fundamental well-being, or temporary well-being is sometimes what he's called it. Because with temporary well-being, you know, it's not always there. You can't always find a yes when you go looking for it. It's kind of how I've heard him describe it. But suddenly I had this experience where no matter what, I could find the yes. And for a lot of people, and this was true for me, that actually is in the foreground at first. If you have a sudden shift, especially if it's not a gradual thing, if you have a sudden shift, that just stays in the foreground. And it's so beautiful and so nice. And it's just like, oh yeah, I don't have to do anything. I obviously just feel okay all the time. And that fades into the background because you know you haven't stabilized it here yet. And then from there, there's just like a series of shifts you can have that gets you further. What I didn't know at the time was what the sort of endpoint would be. I didn't know that there would be like a spot that I would pop out to on the inside of it. So I started I was playing around with the different, like trying to go deeper in my own experience, like just seeing what that felt like. He talks a lot about a technique called sinking in. And this is like he's like, okay, once you're in fundamental being, you have that sense of peace, that sense of everything being okay. You want to sink into that as much as possible, as often as possible, for as long as possible. Like that's the one thing he consistently recommends. And my experience, I was like, well, I'm going to be the best person in the world at sinking in, if that's the case. Like my competitive edge just like kicked in. I'm going to like, let's do it. I'm going to be the #1 sinking inner. So I spent a lot of time sinking in. I would do it during meetings at work. I would like any chance I got, I was like, okay, do I feel fundamentally okay right now? Can I keep having this conversation and speaking words even from this place of fundamental okayness? Can I understand what people are telling me from this place of fundamental okayness? Because I think for a lot of people in meditation, they have this experience of like, oh yeah, I had this amazing meditation experience, but then they can't do anything out of it. Like it's only in meditation that they experience these like profound states. And one of his insights is that you actually want to bring that into as much of normal life as possible. So he talks about, I think the technique that he recommends is called time for fundamental well-being. So you set a random timer on your watch or phone. Anytime it goes off during the day, you just start sinking in. You find fundamental well-being, sink into it as long as you can, and then go about whatever you were doing from that place. So like, you know, it was happening during, I would brush my teeth and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I'm not brushing my teeth from a place of peace. So let me sink in. And then, wow, yeah, brushing my teeth actually feels different because all of my habits, even something as innocuous as brushing my teeth, much less interacting with my family, is coming from these old habits that aren't from a place of feeling okay. They're coming from a place of fear or scarcity or insecurity, whatever it is. So like, how do you overwrite that? And so sinking in is kind of the #1 practice. But in sinking in, I started experiencing what I think he still calls them like the layers of fundamental well-being, where you start to get glimpses of other qualities show up if you sink lower into your experience. And then you can sort of stabilize into these newer qualities is kind of what it seemed like to me based on his presentations of it. It was all a bit abstract, but basically I kind of took sinking in and was able to literally sink lower through my experience. Like it was a literal lowering downwards is what I experienced. And suddenly new qualities would pop up. Like, oh, there's a sense of spaciousness and like, oh, my visuals are flat now and things like that. Like, wow, this really lines up with what he calls location 2 now. And I got there from location 1. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. And like sinking in through that, it's like, oh, suddenly there's a sense of love and connection and like fullness. Suddenly it feels like my body is almost like walking through syrup. And there's like this honey sweetness to it, but it feels really thick. Like my arms are almost moving slower. That seems a lot like what people describe in location 3. So that's interesting. So I was noticing that there was a bit of a progression happening just with me trying to sink in and kind of literally going lower. I was like, I don't want to go any further because everything he talks about further seems like you start, you don't have a sense of agency anymore. And like, you're losing your emotions and blah, blah, blah. I was like, I don't want that. I want to still be able to love my family and like do my job. Like, I don't want to have to become a monk. And then one day I was doing with my EMDR therapist, we did a yoga session and we ended it with this yoga inversion. So I'm like, my feet are up in the air. My shoulders are like, I'm upside down. My shoulders are on this like sort of chair thing. And in that, like, I just felt something drop. And I came out of it. I was like, I didn't really know how to end the session or anything. I don't remember what I said, nothing. I was like, something's different now. I don't know what it is. And as I was walking back home, I was like, what is doing the walking? Like suddenly I wasn't the one walking anymore is what it felt like. Like, oh, that's interesting. Like, do I feel happy right now? What does happiness feel like? Oh, that's interesting. Do I remember what emotions felt like? So there's all these signs of like, oh my God, I think what I'm experiencing is the thing I was so scared of. Location 4, all this stuff that he described of like, oh yeah, you're not going to be making the decisions anymore. You won't have access to emotions. And suddenly I was experiencing it just full on. I was like, oh, this is not what I thought it was going to be at all. Like when all you know is agency and then you hear this like no agency thing, it sounds so scary. Like, oh, well then what if I become an asshole? I don't know. That was my fear, at least. Like, what if suddenly the decision making that happens is me being an asshole to everyone? That's not what happened, but like that was my fear. But really what I experienced was this intense, amazing peace beyond anything I'd ever experienced before. And it was such an overwhelming sense of freedom. And I thought the peak of my experience was going to be that sense of love in what he called location 3. This like, I am at one with everything. I feel in love with the world around me. I thought that was going to be my peak. There's no way anything else could be better than that. Then I accidentally experienced this sense of freedom going a little bit further. I was like, well, shit, like now I got to see what's beyond this. Like this is like, if this is already, this sense of freedom is so amazing. I might need to risk it. So what I did is like, I developed my nervous system to where it could kind of go back and forth between these experiences. Developing fluidity, to use Jeffrey Martin's terms of like, can I get myself into a more functional place and like kind of explore a little bit further at a time? By doing that, I just kept pushing further and I was able to like push 5, 6, 7, like all these locations that he had documented. And my experience was lining up with what he had described. And then I connected with one of his research team, Annemiek, who had the most knowledge and experience about these later experiences. And she's like, yeah, everything you're describing is in line with these later experiences, including past what they had publicly documented. I was like, here's the next shift that they had not written about at all, or very little about. I was like, here's the next couple of shifts. And she's like, yep, that's exactly like mine. Connected with Luciano, blah, blah. The interesting thing for me, though, in talking with them, they didn't have explicit shifts in between each of these locations. But for me, as I was going, because like I said, I didn't surrender or anything, to use Luciano's term. I don't know if it's the same term that you're using, Stefan, for surrender. But for Luciano, he literally said, okay, thy will be done process. I'm along for the ride now. And if a shift happened, it was not in his control. For me, I could see there being a specific technique being used every single time I went further. So I could tell there was a border between 4 and 5, for example. I was like, oh, wow, yeah, my visuals are different now, which is exactly how they describe 5 on their public stuff. So I used the same technique to go to 6, 7. And so it just kept going. I was like, is this just an arbitrary thing that I can do now? Like, is this technique work? And so I kept pushing beyond what I heard anyone describing. I was like, well, sure, this is a cool thing I'm experiencing, but there's no way this actually means anything. Like, it's just a fun consciousness trick that I'm doing. But eventually, in talking to other people, they were having the same arc of their journey as I did. I just assumed mine would be 100% unique. The more people I talked to, the more it seemed like they were having a similar arc to their journey. Even if the specifics weren't the same, there were the same like themes happening in the same rough order from what I could tell. So that was interesting. And then at a certain point, it was like, so I'm going through all these like deep, like, I mean, there's deep emptiness that happens. There's complete falling away of reality for me is what happened. Like, I don't even exist anymore at a certain point. Nothing around me exists at a certain point. I went through the holidays around my family. I was like, I know I love these people and I can tell it's probably good for me to be around them, but I can't feel the love anymore. Like that really fully happened for months. And I just thought that like, why would I go further than this? There's no point in progressing deeper because like it just seems it's going to get more depressing is almost what it felt like. Not that it felt depressing, but like conceptually, that's kind of like, I'm missing out now. But kept pushing further thanks to like me and Luciano were kind of pushing each other along. And eventually what's cool is that you deconstruct everything and then it starts coming back, is what our experience was. Like, oh, it doesn't just pushing further, pushing deeper doesn't mean complete disconstruction, complete obliteration. Naturally, without us trying to do it, it just started reconstructing itself. Eventually to the point where suddenly it felt like I was a normal human again. There was no like distance between myself and my humanity. And the phrase that came that I really want to hammer home in that first talk that we ended up doing after we had pushed like really far along the progression was that you do not have to give up, you do not have to choose between humanity and freedom. For a certain part of the progression, sure, there's like, you're going to give up a bit of humanity, you're going to feel some distance to it. But ultimately, if you keep pushing, everything comes back to this place of fundamental being, even your humanity. So living normal lives, like preferences came back. The trivial preferences, like one of the first things I did after I popped out into the space that I now call complete equanimity, because it's always there all the time without question. I don't have to go looking for it. One of the first things that happened after I shifted into that was, I think I'm going to buy a big flat screen TV. Not that I was identifying with a flat screen TV, but it was like, it's something I had been curious, like wanting to do for a while. And like, why not? And also if it breaks, then I don't care. Like, I don't give a shit. Like, I'm not attached to it in any way, but yeah, it's just like, it's not going to hurt my sense of fundamental being to have a flat screen TV. It was kind of an interesting thing. But yeah, a lot of all that to say, the interesting thing about the journey is that for me, it is about at least this part of the journey. There's more that happens after, but for this part of the journey that I focus on with my deepening framework, it starts with what I call partial equanimity, where you're always okay, but you sometimes have to go looking for it, especially if things are stressful, especially if stuff's going on in your life that's not pleasant. You may have to go looking for it, go, do I still feel okay? Oh, wow, I guess I do still feel okay, even though, my life is kind of falling apart. For some reason, I still feel okay, inexplicably. You go through this journey. It doesn't seem like it has anything to do with peace. It's having to do with, oh, suddenly I can't relate to my memories anymore. Oh, suddenly my emotions are changing, or like my mental activity is decreasing. Doesn't feel like it has anything to do with peace. All that's happening. You go through this journey of deconstruction and reconstruction. Then suddenly on the other side, you just happen to pop out very consistently for people. You just suddenly have complete equanimity now, where you literally can't even go looking for it. It's just there all the time. So I did that myself. I had this like technique that I was doing. Eventually, after one of my talks, talking about how I made progress, someone reached out to me and was like, hey, do you do coaching? I was like, no, why would I do coaching? I just told you how I made progress. Go do it yourself. It's like, that was my idea. I was like, what benefit would you get out of it? They're like, well, let's just see what it is and let's experiment. Or he didn't say let's experiment. It was like, talking with you, I just feel like about my progression would probably be beneficial. I think it would unlock some things for me. So I was like, okay, here's going to be the thing we do. You're going to be my lab rat, and I make no guarantees on anything. We're just going to go into each session, and I'm going to experiment on you, and whatever happens, happens, and that's it. That's the agreement. Like, okay, I can live with that. So like, okay, I started trying to experiment. Like, okay, I know how I did it for myself, but it was so beyond words. It was just a very intuitive thing. Like, how would I get someone to make progress? Like, if I really want to help someone. So in experimenting with him, I was like, okay, there's a consistent thing I'm able to do now where it seems like I'm able to take him from one set of phenomena, a location in Jeffrey's terms, and take him to the next one. And like, there was a technique that sort of seemed to unlock that I could guide someone else through that process. I no longer use Jeffrey's terminologies, but because I think locations and layers and all that, they're used for a different reason than what I use. So in my progression, I tend to talk about positions and regions is kind of, it's just a different perspective on somewhat the same experience. But I could tell that, the point being that I could tell that this guy was making progress, like clearly shifting deeper. Not only that, but like he would come back between sessions, even if he wasn't carrying that moment to moment in his life, he couldn't remember exactly where he had shifted to or anything. His life was changing. He was suddenly having decreased reactivity and things like that. He was having greater mental clarity. He was having greater emotional presence in his coaching that he was doing with other people. So like there were clear knock-on effects that he was having, even if he couldn't tell that he was actually making progress. I was noticing the progress he was making. I could tell because it was lining up with my mental things, but like he couldn't even tell, except for the fact that like I was like, well, man, you were saying this last week, and now you're saying this. He's like, oh my God, you're right. So I was like, okay, that's interesting. That's one person. So let's see, maybe it can work for other people. So I started experimenting with other people. A little bit at a time was refining the terminology, because not everyone's going to resonate with every term, right? And like that's such a crucial thing to try to get to the core terms that pretty much everyone's going to resonate with. For me, I'm trying to like kind of build this engine of deepening is kind of how I think of it, and not use terminology that maybe will put some people off, maybe not resonate with people. So like, what is the actual terms that people are going to be able to resonate with? Refine the terminology. I worked with, I mean, I don't think how many people I worked with total while I was doing individual coaching. I think it was like 20 people, maybe a couple dozen or more people that I worked with individual coaching. But importantly, at least a dozen of them started at the very, very beginning of the process and went all the way to the end of the process. So what was fascinating is that consistently, even if people were interpreting it completely differently, consistently what they reported after each shift, the core of it lined up, which was surprising, because a lot of times they would come in and I didn't like, maybe they were actually further along than I expected them to be because they had made progress in between our sessions. Or maybe they weren't, maybe I had expected them to be further along. And so I was asking certain questions, but then I had to go, oh, wait, like, so I was asking certain questions, kind of projecting that they were a certain spot in the progression. And then once I realized that the answers they were giving me were for this other spot, and I readjusted, then all their shifts started to make sense. Because part of me was really worried that I'm just projecting my own experience onto people and that that's what they're actually progressing through. But even when my projection was completely wrong, they still followed like the progression, which was fascinating. Like that, completely unexpected. Very cool though. Another thing was that this took me so off guard. So let's just take like from position 3 to position 4 in my model. A common thing that drops off is like I'll ask people, so try to remember something that happened to you in the last day or two. Nothing emotional, just a normal event. It's like a lunch you had or something like that. So like, one, does it come to mind easily? Does anything come to mind? So that's the first thing. Almost always people can answer that no matter where they are in the progression. But then I go, okay, well, now try to dive into the details of that. What were you wearing? What did the room look like? What sounds were there? Who else was there? How easy is it to access those details? Is it easy? So that's an interesting thing. Does it feel like they're further away? The memory itself, does it feel like you have to reach further or like go in a roundabout way to get to the memory? Or is there resistance to diving into the details in the first place? Like, why would I do that? So for a lot of people from 3 to 4, suddenly it goes from being, oh yeah, it's a memory. It's right. I just had a lunch right before this meeting. Then they go, oh wait, that feels like it was days ago, even though I know it happened right before this meeting. That's a common thing. The most fascinating shift I heard happen though, 2 people in the same week, 2 people who did not know each other, had never talked. They didn't know anything about this. You gave the same example. They're like, oh, it's like my memories are on this bookshelf and I can see the spines of the book. And if I wanted to, I could reach in and grab the book and flip through the pages. But why would I do that? Because the present moment is so nice. 2 people said almost the exact same thing word for word in the same week. It was wild. And neither of them had ever said anything like that before. They were like, I don't know why I'm saying this. This seems weird to me, but and then they answered it. So there's some really interesting consistencies that happen. Yeah, I can keep talking about this, but I realize I've been talking for a while. We could do some, I don't know, follow-ups on that.
So I wanted to mention something when you talked about going home to your parents and that non-feeling.
Yeah.
And what I got from that was that, well, first of all, the shift that you made when you were doing that headstand on the chair,
Yeah.
it sounds exactly like what happened to Eckhart Tolle when he was sitting in his bed and he was considering committing suicide. He had the same exact, he expressed it very much like you did. That was number one. Number two, when you went home to your parents, it seems as though that shift had created a feeling of you were losing attachments to that emotional thing that humans are attached to, and you were sitting in more of a state of peace with it that doesn't really make a judgment. Hence, there's no attachment to it. It's just, it is what it is.
Yeah, so the space I was in when I went back home for the holidays, it was like a much further progression than that initial spot I was talking about. Like it's a much deeper. So it's like I'm way that one, it still feels like the present moment is so real and happening, even if emotional attachment kind of falls away. The present moment still feels real and like everything's unfolding and it's kind of amazing and free feeling. That experience is more like I wouldn't even use the word peace there. Maybe from an external perspective, it looks peaceful, but like peace doesn't even feel like it exists there because not like everything is just an idea. Like it's kind of obvious that everything's just a construct. Everything's just a progression. Some people talk about everything feeling like a hologram, even. That's not a common way of putting it, but that's how some people say it. Some people feel like they're dead and like they're just seeing like I don't know, they're just a ghost floating through reality in this kind of thing. That's an extreme version, but like the common experience is that oh, there is no reality, even to the emotional experience. There's no like emotions aren't even real. Like I'm constructing emotions is kind of what the experience is. So yeah, it ends up being, yeah, there's no attachment because what could you attach to is really like that's ultimately what it feels like on a subjective level. Like there's literally nothing to attach to. And actually, now that I'm saying this right now, one of the things that I think was a cool lesson for me in all of this was that so many people come at all of this from the wrong angle, in my perspective. They try to go, okay, how do I change my mindset in order to change my experience? That's the exact opposite of what you need to do. You need to change your experience, which then can't help but change your mindset. If you have shifted to a point where you literally can't conceive of the things around you being real or your own self being real, it's kind of hard to like cling to identity and spiral because of some wound to your ego. It's just harder to do that. So like you don't even need to, your beliefs are naturally going to change by changing your experience. Um, anyway,
But it's beyond a mindset, I think,
yeah,
because if if you reach that point of living in the present moment, there's really no thinking about it. You don't have to go to a mindset. You're
right.
just having an experience and you're being. But I wanted to clear something
Yeah,
up about meditation. Um,
sure.
Meditation, the way I see it, and this is all personal, to me, it's like going to the gym and working out and building a muscle. It doesn't mean that the only place is sitting down in front of a shrine or a picture of a guru and meditating, because once you have worked out that muscle, once you've deepened it, for me anyway, the experience is that a shaft kind of comes into your being, first of peace, where the solar plexus is no longer tightening up, where you're having an experience of this beautiful sense of being in a state of peace. And then it moves into light, where light comes down into the shaft. And it basically is your center of creativity. Now, if creativity is the center of the cosmos, because everything is based on being created, that light that comes in opens up that creativity shaft, and great artists have it, great singers have it, great computer science geniuses have it. That sense of light that comes in opens up that space and creativity where there's no ego involved anymore. You're just able to access all of the universe coming into you and then you creating out of it. So that for me is what happens in meditation. And I'm a digital artist as well as a photographer. And I have to tell you, photography was a great meditation for me, because when I would go and do events, once you understand the tool itself, you're just being. You're using that camera as though it's part of your body. It's expressing itself through your creative force. And then when I got into digital art and I started to understand expressing creativity, what was coming out was just like this flow through the light onto the screen, and If people liked it, they liked it. If they didn't, they didn't. But I didn't really have any judgment about it, or I wasn't directing it. That's what I'm trying to say. It was
Yeah.
just happening. I was just like, it's just
The
happening.
channel. Yeah, yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. It was just a channel. And I think that's something that you're probably trying to express in your working with your method, uh, without getting into a spiritual, you know, nomenclature of it, So,
Yeah, the thing that you're talking about is actually something that's, I don't know if y'all are familiar with the telepathy tapes that have recently come out or anything. I highly recommend looking into it if not.
Yeah, it's getting a lot of play on the POK in the POK community. So yeah,
Yeah,
talk
that makes sense.
about that.
Well, I'm not going to say too much about it because I'm probably going to give a talk on it. So I'm like all of my words on it are formulating still. There is a lot of it's coalescing, but like it did unlock something for me that was kind of like disconnected for a while. In that this like sense of connection to the source of like and like just being a channel and all these sorts of things. Um, one thing that I'm noticing with my own work because like I do feel like I am like something is developing in me related to that specifically. Like, how do you make that connection more consistently, more readily available? How do you maintain that flow? The interesting thing about the deepening framework is like it seems if you want to kind of put it in a couple of easy words, which you shouldn't, but let's just say we wanted to. It's about dropping all these resistances. So like we have so many resistances build up in our psyche to actual experience that's just happening all around us. So like we have all these concepts that are useful from a certain perspective, but they really get in the way of just experiencing life, experiencing reality. And so with the deepening framework, that process of deconstructing and then sort of the reintegration that automatically happens, it's about like getting rid of all these resistances. What I've noticed is that when you make it through that whole process from like partial to complete equanimity, on the other side of it, it's so much easier to access life and like the flow and the source, whatever you want to call it. Like that is so much, it's such a better foundation than struggling to be like, why can't I reconnect with that thing? Like it's like, oh wait, it's just right there. Once you know that it's there, if you have no resistances anymore, if you don't have any of those walls in your ego, whatever you want to call it, uh set up anymore, it's just so much easier to be a natural conduit. An interesting anecdote, this is not necessarily like a research finding because we are researching these later experiences like after complete equanimity, like what comes next. So this is not a research finding, but anecdotally in talking to people and in my own experience, after getting to that point, synchronicity kind of went off the charts for me. It was kind of wild. I was like, oh, like that used to feel like the most magical. That would have been like the highlight of my year, this sort of thing happening. I would have been talking about it for a while, but now it just happens multiple times a week. So it's almost like not a big deal. Like it's kind of crazy how much that seems to increase for a lot of people once you get to this point, which I think is kind of cool because it's to me that's the evidence of like, yeah, the natural flow is just happening now. Like you don't have to go looking for it even. It's just there. Which
well,
yeah, it's kind of awesome.
you've taken that brick out of the wall, so it's opened up a channel,
That's a good
a
way of
hole
putting
there.
it. Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of bricks in that wall, and you go back to your PTSD.
Hmm.
You remember what it was like to feel that
Oh yeah.
PTSD. So, people who uh, can't pay their rent, don't have a car, can't get to where they want to go, don't have a job. There's a lot of worry in there,
Yeah.
and it's hard to find peace when you're in that kind of situation. So, everybody's got a different way of handling all of this shit. And I'm not sure that when you do your method, do you take into consideration all these different people and uh, uh, their inner workings, the chemistry that's being produced from their brains that's setting them off here or setting them off there? Do you have individual things for each one of these, or do you have to find the center, so to speak, where everybody can join in the same channel?
Yeah, it's sort of like I wouldn't quite consider calling it finding the center, but I guess that kind of is what I'm doing. One, I will say one, there was at least one or two people that me and the couple of coaches I was working with who are now building a more complete protocol out of this. Um, there's definitely one person that I worked with who could not work with this method. Like they couldn't work with being guided by someone else. That actually took a lot of pressure off me because I was like, well, man, if it's 100% effective, then I'm like, is it a me thing? Like, is it actually something that other people can use? I really wanted this to be like, okay, get this out there, let other people be able to guide others through it. Like I didn't want it to just be dependent on me and like my energy or whatever. So that seeing that, okay, it didn't work for someone else, that kind of gave me some hope that it's a real thing that, could be taught potentially. But like I worked with them for 3 sessions, I want to say, and by like every single time, I'm like, I don't understand what's happening. It feels like nothing is going on in these sessions, and I don't want to waste their time anymore. And I feel bad for like taking their money if nothing's happening. However, a lot of people are trying to solve that problem after I would mention that. But for me, when I reflect on my own experience, I don't think I could have submitted to someone else's guidance for this either. I think for me, like because my system didn't trust enough, like I had to be able to find a technique for myself, right? So like I'm gonna say that as a caveat of like, yes, I try to find the things that can affect most people, but like obviously every technique is gonna have who it resonates with and who it doesn't, right? I'm trying to find the highest leverage, highest impact techniques, but man, pick and choose whatever's gonna work for you, right? Like even my map, it's not meant to be a map for everyone, for every type of awakening or anything like that. Like it's meant to just like, okay, if someone's using this technique, how far along are they from like complete, from partial to complete? So like, I'm like, even with my map, which for me is kind of like a semi-universal thing for this process, it's not universal in like I'm trying to capture all of awakening kind of sense. Like that's that. So I'm saying all that. However, for the framework itself, and if you go into my website, there's like kind of 4 core techniques. One is sinking in, which is not even my technique. That's totally stolen from Jeffrey Martin. I just formulate it in a way that I don't think Jeffrey ever did. Like I give specific formulation for it. I have a guided sinking in meditation on my YouTube and stuff like that, which I have a link to on my website. So that's the core technique. Like how do you get better at just tapping into that sense that everything's okay? Then there's actual shifting. And that is literally lowering downwards through the experience to find the next experience. I don't have a guided version of that yet on my YouTube, but maybe someday. I've been promising it for a year and a half now. Maybe I'll actually do it at some point. So yeah, so that's kind of the core of it, is like guiding someone through it. And then there's specific inquiry questions that you can ask, which are also available on my website. So like the inquiry is really important. So if someone's trying to do this on their own, from what I can tell, it's important that you try to articulate what you are noticing about your experience. What has changed for you? Try to get those into words, and even better is try to explain it to someone else. Even if they can't resonate with it, try to get it into a way where at least they can mentally kind of somewhat grasp it. For some reason, it seems like that, not for some reason, I think I know why, bringing this like deeper experience up into the mind and into like your social awareness seems to stabilize it to where you can actually live from there a lot easier. From what I could tell, that seems like a really important part of the process. So not only are you like going deep and like really like diving into what's next, but then like bringing that up to conscious awareness makes it seem like it's a lot easier to integrate with your normal life. So it's kind of the core process. You just loop through of like sinking in and shifting and notice what changed, that sort of thing. But then supplemental that, and this is kind of where it gets to like, okay, if someone's not engaging with the process or different types of things come up for people, like for a lot of people at certain points in the process, all of a sudden fear will come up or like anger will come up. And they're like, I don't know what the hell just happened. But like we're getting rid of resistances. So like obviously, if you get away enough resistances, things that you've put way down below conscious awareness are going to start bubbling up. Almost every single person I worked with had at least one or two, I want to say every single person had at least 1 or 2 sessions where we had to spend a full session or two on just working with these resistances or fears or things like that come up with a process I call active deconditioning. It's related to what Jeffrey used to call edging. But it's just like you sit with the sense that everything's okay and you kind of bring that into whatever the resistance is or whatever the fear is or distraction. And eventually it just becomes part of the sense that everything's okay. Like it kind of just gets integrated naturally with it. So that's one of the ways that kind of like, the content of what comes up is different, but the technique seems to be pretty consistently effective for people. The other one, which shouldn't surprise anyone, I hope, who's listening to this podcast, gratitude is a really powerful practice. But in light of trying to make progress, the interesting like gratitude as a technique, not just as a, you should practice gratitude like broadly. Let's just say that that's good because it is like gratitude is fucking awesome. But like specifically related to this, it's actually very useful whenever you're trying to go like you get this feeling of I need to go further and you're kind of pushing it and forcing it. Like, why am I not further along than I think I should be? Like this sense of effort, this sense of frustration almost. Um, Whenever that happens, what I found for myself, and this has also been true for everyone I've worked with, is that whenever that comes up, leaning back and going like, you know what? The fact that I feel okay at all on any level is pretty awesome. And really, truly just allowing yourself to feel grateful that even if you never go further, what you're already experiencing and that like having any access to that is so amazing, and just sitting with it and kind of forgetting about the progress you need to make. What in my experience, almost every time that would immediately like slingshot me. Like 15 minutes later, I'd suddenly be slingshot to wherever I was trying to get to. That seems to consistently happen for people as well. Like I've worked with a lot of people who it's like they're trying to like force like going into the next thing that's deeper. And it's like, okay, let's just back up
All right.
because dude, who cares? Like really, like we're doing this, we're along for the ride. But even if this is where you stop, like just you have access to something that's amazing. And that almost like inevitably, not almost inevitably, every single time we would just sit with that 15 minutes, 30 minutes, however long it takes. And they were able to make progress pretty easily after that.
Jeffrey Martin was a psychologist. Is that his
I'm not
background?
Sure. Well, he has a lot of backgrounds. So like he was a famous Reiki teacher for a while and things like that. His academic background, I'm not sure what like department he would have been under, if he's like considered like cognitive science or psychology. So it's somewhere in that range. I would probably consider him a consciousness researcher at this point. Like I think consciousness is kind of its own field, enough of its own field now. But yeah, he is also now the president of the California Institute for Human Sciences. So that's got like a lot of integral studies and consciousness studies, things like that. But I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure what his academic background is. Yeah, well, and like to be clear, like the deepening stuff that I'm talking about is not like that's all my thing. It's not really like that's not Jeffrey Martin stuff. I have formulated a lot of things and like crystallized a lot of things and like kind of put a pinpoint on what he's done. But
And I think one thing that characterizes the POK community in general is that I get the sense that many, if not most of us, have kind of moved on from Jeffrey's model. As we heard here today, Rastal has, taken, it's a good place to start, let's say, and become familiar with. But then, we moved on and each in our own way. Rastal has developed his own model. So I don't see any value on dwelling on Jeffrey. I mean, he created a good thing, a few good. I took all his courses; they're all great. Finder's course, Awakening course, Thriving course. They're all great, but to me, that just served as a basis, a foundation for further explorations. And I think Rostel is a perfect example, and others too have taken Jeffrey's foundational work and have really moved on and taken it to newer and I think much higher levels.
yeah, I'm me for one. Like I for a long time, and I kind of still say this for a long time. I was saying that like my fundamental being is like it's because of Jeffrey Martin. Like I would not be experiencing this, or I would be very unlikely to be experiencing this if it wasn't for Jeffrey Martin, right? I'm so grateful for his work. I think his approach to studying this stuff is incredible and groundbreaking, and it is like the best foundation we could kind of hope for. As far as how it like yes, my deepening, all of my exploration in the deepening framework and everything is based on that. But he never really, I know he never really did he. I'm not going to say what he was doing. I would have a hard time believing that he was approaching this from a therapy perspective. Like he's trying to help people, obviously, right? Me, I'm kind of the same way. Like I don't like people who are using my framework now to do coach other people. It is more therapeutic. Like I'm not really focusing on like how do you go live your life from this place. Like people had questions about that, but all I was focusing on was like this laser focus on here is this specific part of the process, and here's a specific aspect of it. So partial complete equanimity. And I'm just like so focused on this very tiny portion. I think it's an important portion. I think it's actually a life-changing portion if you can get from one to the other. but like in general, in my mind, therapy is a bit more holistic than what I have done with the deepening framework. It's just it can be used as part of therapy, right? But yeah.
But you had a time period where you had experience with suicidal thoughts, you said, and
Yeah, and I
you
did EMDR for a long time, which is eye movement desensitization something. But it's a trauma therapy. Yeah.
right,
So,
but you know
yeah.
what the feeling is like to have those suicidal thoughts.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So you had the experience.
Yeah. Yeah. For
So
sure.
you have people coming to you that might also be suffering from
Oh,
PTSD
yeah.
and
Right.
having
Right.
suicidal thoughts. How do you direct them with your process, or do you not even have a specific thing for that? I mean,
Oh, yeah. Yeah. There's no. My thing is like if all the work that I did was like, can we get you to a place where you can just focus on that sense that everything's okay, that sense of peace, ease, whatever term you're going to resonate with? Can we get you to a point where you can focus on it for the duration of this session? If someone's not at that point, then they should go to a psychiatrist, like a therapist, is really what my recommendation. I'm in no way trained to get someone to that point if they're like so like driven by trauma and they're triggered by everything. I tried working with one person who was like that, and it was just a lot of effort. And like I was trying to help because they had done therapy for a while, and it just wasn't. Something seemed to be a block there. And we were able to do some work, but it's not like this framework is so focused on just that part of it that if someone's trying to do a broader coaching program or therapeutic type modality, they would need those tools, which I don't have those tools, and I'm not focused on them. So.
right, but it's part of your introduction. So if people read your introduction on your website, you talk about your past and
Mhm.
your the things that you've gone through, and they may feel that you can help them in some way because you've had the experience. I'm
Yeah,
just
but I also talk about the years of therapy that I was in. So like that's really what I would point people to, honestly, like every time. Like if they're gonna ignore that, I don't know what I can do, but like I legitimately had to get to a stable point. And this is actually kind of interesting because I didn't know Jeffrey and them talked about this, but like in their first finders course, they had a couple of people who were suicidally depressed. One of them fell off the map and they like ended up in some like psychiatric ward in Australia or something like that. Like it was very scary for them. So after that point, and again, because this process, we're lowering resistances and removing them. So things can come up that are really scary. So if you don't have a support network, you do need to be careful about it, right? So I mean, it's very possible I could just like revise the wording on my website to be more clear about that up front. But for me, it never felt like the right time to pursue this until I just happened to be stable already. And then I found out later that Jeffrey and them recommend that actually, if you're going to like come into these programs, you want a baseline of not being constantly suicidally depressed or something. I don't know.
That's a very common disclaimer, not only for Jeffrey Martin's Finders course, but a lot of courses and spiritual things that I've taken. There's a disclaimer right up front. Listen, this is not therapy, okay?
Right.
This
Yeah.
is not this is not to help you, adjust to your life. And if you have psychological problems, you should see a psychiatrist, psychologist to take, whatever antidepressant. But no, so this is not therapy. And I think it's very important because I think people in general, a lot of seekers make the mistake of thinking, oh, I'm going to become enlightened, awakened, whatever term you want to put on it, and that's going to solve my problems. Well, no, it's not. And
Right.
people who have been working in this field know, like, hold on, if you have psychological problems, deal with that first. And as you say, Rastal, get stable. Okay,
Yeah.
have some stability, and then then we can start to work on these other things. But it's not therapy. And in
Right.
fact, one of the things, this person from our community who does these MDMA
Mhm.
healing journeys. One of the same kind of things. You have to go through a screening and saying, look, if you got psychological problems, this may trigger you, put you in a far worse shape. So it's good to be clear that this is not therapy. This is something, it's another realm
Right.
of
well,
experience.
I'm glad you both brought this up. So anybody listening to this podcast,
Right.
if you have some deep issues, it would be advisable to go seek therapy elsewhere and not call Rastal up on the phone and look for his help at this moment.
Yeah, well,
Get clear
However,
first. Get clear first, and
yeah,
then come.
yeah, I think most people watching this who would gravitate to this podcast wouldn't be dealing with a whole lot of psychological issues, although that may apply. So people looking at this podcast, if anything you hear here resonates with you, you can we'll put Rastal's website, contact information, and you can contact and work one-on-one if you want to go. You want to go
oh,
deep.
I'm not
Oh, you're
doing
not.
one-on-one work anymore.
Oh, you're not doing it. Oh, so what are you doing now? Okay, so
Yeah,
what?
yeah. Well, real quick, but before we go into further stuff, I just want to comment on the like therapy and things like that because there's an overcorrection as well where you try to think you have to get completely clear before you can go down this road, which is not true. Like you can spend like a lot of people do think they have to decondition completely. I got to get rid of all my conditioning before I make progress. That's absolutely false. What I'm talking about is just baseline stability, like get a support system in place to where if things come up, you have people you can contact and rely on that like your life won't completely fall apart. Like is the main thing I'm talking about. If you're suicidal depressed, like suicidal ideations constantly, go seek professional help. However, once you reach a baseline stability, this process actually does solve a whole like category of problems by itself. Because if you can't even identify with thoughts anymore, then it's hard. Like there's certain like feedback loops that just get like cut off at the root by this process. So it won't solve all your problems, but it will like actually remove a certain level of problems for you. Like people really consistently report reduced reactivity. Like that's a really common thing to the point where their spouses are reporting reduced reactivity, like in frustration, like, oh, I can't push their buttons in the way that I used to. Like literal, these are complaints that I've gotten from spouses about people who have gone through the process with me, which is kind of funny. But yeah, so there are genuine things that this process literally just does consistently for people. Solving all psychological issues is not one of them. It just yeah, there's still a lot of work to do. Which people who make it really far, if you're familiar with the fetters program, I know plenty of people who are like confirmed past the 10th fetter. They've dropped all the fetters and they're in EMDR and doing therapy for trauma and things like that. Like all that's still part of this process. One of the cool things in my own experience and in talking to other people is that the more like therapy and trauma work you do, it seems like the more effective this process is, and vice versa. Like I did EMDR before and after shifting into fundamental well-being, and EMDR after was so much more effective. To the point where like things started deconditioning so fast that we were almost going too slow in the EMDR sessions. It was kind of crazy how effective it got by the end of it. Anyway, so just throwing all that out there. Yes, please do therapy. I highly recommend.
And I want to say one other thing. This reminds me of a story. I don't know if it's the Dalai Lama or some very highly respected Buddhist master says yes. I forget the full quote, but the bottom line is this: yes, there are plenty of Buddhist masters out there who could use some psychotherapy. So the two things are these are two. They're connected. Everything's connected,
Right,
but they're
absolutely connected.
different realms. Different realms. You could be enlightened and still. And as Jeffrey says, you can be enlightened. If you're an asshole before you're enlightened or shifted, you'll be an asshole afterwards, most likely. Yes, you could have some, great transformation. I want to say two things at this point.
Yeah.
I had two things I wanted to cover. We covered the deepening process, I think, really great, really
Sure.
great. The other one was the Amplify conference. I don't have the energy to do it now, and it's going to run too long. I would say this: either we do another session just devoted to the Amplify conference because I want to really go into it, and also
Sure.
to promote it. I'm going to go out there, so naturally I want to help pump it up.
Yeah,
We,
sweet.
we, we could do it on another podcast, or we could have a radio show, radio interview show. I could interview you and post it around. But as far as I don't think we have enough time. I don't have enough energy to get into, unless you really want to get into the Amplify conference at this point.
Well, how about this? We don't even have registration available. We don't have our room block booking link yet. I'm down for coming back whenever we actually have a lot more information on Amplify, if that's
Great
down.
idea. So in other words, let's get something in place. I mean, I
Yeah.
didn't know where you were in the process. Once you have something in place, let's come back and just explore the Amplify conference and what's going to go on there and who we're going to
Sure.
have with the pro. I think it'll be very interesting.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about. I have actually never talked about it in public before. We didn't know, which is kind of honestly so like it's kind of incredible that 150 people from around the world showed up for it when we did basically nothing to advertise. Like we
Right.
sent out the POK blast, right? And I
Yeah.
think that was enough energy that people were like, shit. Like Angelo, I think blasted out and Frank, but we only got one person from Frank's community who showed up, and then like 20
And
people from Angelo, which is
Angelo didn't attract many people either. I mean,
it
his
was 20 people, which is actually it's nice. Like that's over 10% of the people were from Angela's community specifically, but it's still not like not like half of the
So
people.
this is even better because you don't have the stuff in place. Let's wait and then we'll do another podcast.
Let me just talk about that real quick. So we have a couple of different things that I'm aware of that are based off the deepening framework. So there's guidedshifting.com it is based off the deepening framework. They're actually doing a core POK session on the date of this recording. It may be done by now. But so that's
No, it's
Jason.
coming up in a half an hour, and I'm going to go see what this guy has to say. What's his name?
Oh,
Jason Stoll.
Jason.
I want to see what
Mhm.
he has to say vis-a-vis what you have said. It's going to
Yep.
be very interesting. It's coming up at 2 o'clock, so I want to
Yeah,
make
yeah.
sure.
So there's that. And then the one that I'm involved with though is the deepeningprotocol.com. I have a link to that on my website as well. It's not me running it, but basically Boris and Colette, who I worked with last year, they're part of the POK community. I worked with them last year when I was trying to build a coaching org and then burnt out and realized that's not something I wanted to do. They actually took everything that we were working on together and just like did their own spinoff, which I think is amazing. They're doing a training program. We're like halfway through the first coaching training cohort of like 6 or 8 people, something like that. They're doing guided deepenings, like using the process that I developed, but they're also focused more on the like holistic, how do people integrate, and also what do you do after you get to the end of my framework, which I think is huge. It's just something I don't focus on, but it's a huge part of the process because once you get to the end, all of a sudden, I mean, there's no resistances, very, very common. There's like crazy amount of conditioning that'll come back up. And I think it's good to have help going through all that stuff. So
So we'll post all these links, the links that you just mentioned.
yeah.
Colette and Boris, of course, I know, and I know they're very active in the community. We'll post all these links so people who might want to follow up can follow up. That's really
Sure.
great. That's really great.
Yeah. Also, I have a lot going on right now. But the other thing is the awakening research, the formal academic research with Luciano that's happening. Luciano and then Pierce Aguero's program at Penn State. We're sharing data with them because they're doing some other related research. From what we can tell, we're the first people to ever focus on the progression of awakening over time. Because Jeffrey was studying awakening in snapshots. We're saying, okay, how do those snapshots change over time? From what we can tell, we're the first like non-tradition, like pan-tradition, non-denominational, non-religious approach to this ever. And we've done a lot of literature review at this point. So very cool. We're wrapping up that. We're about to go. We finished the data collection interviews section, and we're about to do the data analysis, and we'll probably be publishing it in the next few months. Pretty exciting. This is fun.
Russell, this has been great.
Do a guided sinking in real quick.
Oh, God is sinking in. Yeah, I love it. Yeah, go ahead. Let's do it.
All right. Okay, so let's just take a moment. We can take a deep breath in and let it out nice and slowly. And as we're doing this, feel free to close your eyes or keep them open, whichever's most comfortable for you. But we want to stay alert, but nice and comfortable. And as you continue to breathe, just allow yourself to settle more and more into this moment, into this experience. If any thoughts show up, any resistance, or any distractions, just let yourself notice them and gently come back to the underlying experience. And as you continue to breathe, allow yourself to notice, do I right now feel fundamentally okay? And just see how or where that shows up for you. Maybe there's a sense of peace. Maybe there's a sense of ease. Maybe it's in the body or around the body. Maybe it's everywhere or nowhere. Wherever it is, just gently allow your awareness to rest on that experience, settling in more and more with every breath. As you continue to breathe, allow yourself to dissolve into that experience, letting it touch every part of your awareness. And as you continue to breathe, allow yourself to express a sense of gratitude for having any access to the experience. If you can, allow those feelings of gratitude to arise. Otherwise, just orient yourself in the direction of gratitude for this experience of okayness. Just sit with that and breathe it in for a bit. And with every breath, just allow the gratitude to radiate more and more throughout your system. Allow yourself to feel it in your body, in every limb, in your torso, in your head, and everywhere around yourself as well. And continue to breathe. Allow yourself to come back to that underlying experience of everything being okay, or that sense of peace or ease or stillness. Just gently resting awareness on that. And just continue to breathe. Allow yourself to notice different aspects or qualities of the experience. See if it's maybe full or empty, or maybe neither, or both. As you notice the underlying experience, see if it's dynamic and unfolding, maybe flowing from moment to moment, or if it feels static or still or sort of fixed in place. And notice your emotions. Are you experiencing a range of emotions right now? Any emotions? Is there maybe a subtle pleasantness to the experience? Or maybe it's just neutral. And look into your body. Do you feel connected to a body at all? Does it feel like an entire body or just sensations arising? Or maybe something completely different? And allow yourself to settle just once again without any questions, without any thoughts, just into that underlying experience. No need to notice anything in particular about it. Just feel yourself becoming stable here. Like being here is just as easy as breathing. All right, and as you continue to breathe, allow yourself to gently wiggle your fingers and toes, allowing this experience to enter your body awareness. And when you're ready and it feels right, you can gently open your eyes and slowly look around the room, allowing the seeing, the hearing, and all of your experience to come from this place. All right. Anything interesting happen?
Yeah, it was great. I had kind of an interesting experience
Oh yeah,
that
totally.
that popped out out of nowhere that I wouldn't have expected, but it was great. It was nice, and I think it was a great way to end the show. And also the great thing is people looking at the podcast can enter into that same experience, and I think it's a great exercise. That's good.
So yeah, cool. Well, thanks for having me, y'all. This was
Thank
fun.
you.
Hey, thanks for being on. And when we get the thing in place for the gathering in Chicago, we'll do another one, and we'll just talk about that.
Sure. Yeah, it'll be a couple months probably before
Yeah, that's
we're
good.
fully ready for
'Cause
that.
it's not till October, so
Right,
cool,
right, right. We got some time, and then it's still enough time for people to actually decide if they want to go. So yeah,
cool.
cool.
All right, we're good.
We're good.
That's good.
Thanks for stopping by, and it was great.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
See you next time.
Sounds good.